on today's episode, we talk about how the upcoming EPC sea changes will affect leasehold properties, how little regulation there is in the property management sector, and the need for leasehold reform, with our special guest, Chief Communications Officer for the Property Institute, Jaclyn Mangaroo. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jaclyn. It's really great to have you on and to talk about leasehold and also EPCs as well. As I was just saying before we just started, those are two really big popular topics that we always get on Property 118. So it's really great to have you on today. But before we talk about that, could we just please talk about the Property Institute? So, for people that don't know, could you just explain a little bit to our viewers about what the Property Institute does and how did it all start?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to meet you, and hello to all your viewers. The Property Institute is a professional body for the property management industry, the sector. It was formed fairly recently, about 3 years ago, from the merger of two previous organisations. So one of them was the Association of Residential Managing Agents, known as ARMA. That was founded about 30 years ago. And about 10 years later, the Institute of Residential Property Management, IRPM, was also formed. And the reason that that started was because, particularly with property management, there was no regulation in the sector. And so those two professional bodies and trade bodies existed to kind of raise standards, to provide guidance, expertise, and also to provide qualifications for people coming into the industry. And such was the desire to get some regulation and to improve standards that ARMA and IRPM decided to join forces and to merge about 3 years ago, and we formed the Property Institute.
Wow, that sounds really, really great. And how many members do you have now?
So we have about 7,000 individual members, property managers working across the country. So from Scotland all the way down to South England and Wales, working across all tenures. So factoring up in Scotland and leasehold, retirement properties, student accommodation, and also retirement properties. And on the member firm side, we have about 350 managing agents who are accredited with us. So pretty sizable chunk of the industry, I would say.
That's great to hear about how the Property Institute has grown and grown. And it seems that you really have like a sizable majority, and hopefully it grows more in the future as well. And now moving on to the EPCC targets. Now that's going through a lot of change and a lot of people are worried about it. So in the private rented sector, Ed Miliband has announced that he wants all private rented sector properties to meet EPCC targets by 2030. There's also some changes in the EPC consultation as well, as next year they want to reform the way how EPCs are measured. So that's obviously going to be a huge change as well. So I'd be really interested to hear, with all these changes going on with the energy efficiency targets, what does the Property Institute think about that?
I think, first of all, I think we welcome any measures that is going to, decarbonise the housing stock. It's one of the largest contributors to carbon emissions, and I think it's important that the government focus on it. And particularly with the way EPCs are measured, I think that's a really important step forward. I think it does need reform. Where we have concerns around the plans for this is that when you get to leasehold properties, there is a prevention within leasehold law that stops improvements being made in a building. So that is there as a protection mechanism. So a landlord has a duty to repair and maintain a building, as in the building owner, the freeholder, but they can't make improvements and pass that on to leaseholders through the service charge. So it's there as a protection mechanism. What that means is that landlords, if they wanted to make any energy efficiency improvements, they would have to fund that themselves throughout the whole building. Now, building owners don't necessarily pay the energy bills for the whole building. That's shared amongst the leaseholders. And if you're a leaseholder, you can't touch the communal part. So you can't touch walls and you can't touch windows. You can't make any improvements that way. So we're really concerned that if the government is pushing for EPC minimum energy efficiency standards, we need to unlock that ability to be able to make those improvements in the first place. So leasehold stock at the moment makes up about 20% of housing. So there's about 5 million leasehold units out there. About 38% of those, so 1.82 million, are actually let out on the private rented sector. So that's a fairly big chunk. So by pushing these EPC targets, what that means is that leaseholders who are landlords, who are letting out their flats in the private rented sector, are not going to necessarily be able to meet those targets if they are prevented from doing so in their lease. And that will have a real significant impact on the supply of rental property.
It will do, as you say, the supply and demand at the moment, that's a huge, huge issue. And
Yeah.
going on to the leasehold properties as well, because I think not a lot of people realise, but quite a lot of leasehold properties are actually quite tall and they're quite sort of in older buildings as well.
Yes.
And so it's going to be really hard to upgrade them. And so it kind of begs the question, is it actually realistic to meet these targets?
I think we've seen with the building safety crisis and the remediation program that's still ongoing, nearly 8 years after Grenfell, how long it's taking, how much it's costing to even replace cladding on the building. So if you compare that to putting in insulation to the fabric of the building, that gives you an idea of how long that is going to take. Yes, our members manage probably about 60,000 blocks just as a representative sample. So that is going to take a number of years to bring those buildings up to scratch. And there are a lot of older buildings. For new builds, it's not a problem. But for the legacy stock, as I say, because that improvement clause is not available, it's going to be really difficult. There's no funding mechanisms for leaseholders to be able to access grants. Yes, they can make small changes within the demise of their property to try and bring that EPC grade up, but there's only so much they can do without the permission of the building owner or the rest of the leaseholders within the building. And I think, if we just ignore 20% of the housing stock as part of our, rush to net zero, we're going to really undo the whole premise, which is to decarbonize a lot of these buildings. And that's not to mention listed buildings. What do we do with them? They have much stricter planning obligations around them. So, and there's a lot of listed buildings in this country that have been converted into flats and they are available under the leasehold tenure. So what do we do with those buildings?
Exactly as you say there. I didn't realize sort of about like obviously there's a lot of listed buildings, and for them it might just not be realistic or even viable for them to meet
Yeah,
EPCC targets.
yeah.
And moving on, obviously now, what would the Property Institute like to see from the government in regards to these energy efficiency changes? What would the Property Institute like to see the government to do?
Well, I think it's difficult because the government doesn't have a lot of funds at the moment. They've inherited quite a lot of debt. So I know there's not a lot of money floating around. I think whilst we're focusing on remediating buildings and replacing cladding, wouldn't it be a good idea to improve the insulation of the building at the same time whilst we've got contractors there and scaffolding on site? That's one thing. The second thing I would say is to consider when you are thinking about home grants for energy efficiency, make that accessible to the leaseholders, either the freeholders who own the building, which in some cases is residents, but also for the individual leaseholder themselves, because at the moment they're not going to be able to access those. And they could exempt themselves, but that doesn't actually do anything to bring the carbon emissions down. The third thing is it's quite a niche, but it's quite simple, is to imply terms into leases that jump over that anti-improvement clause. So it basically adopts more of like a common hold system, whereby if the majority of leaseholders in the block want to be able to, improve the efficiency, triple glazing, solar panels on the roof, etc., they can come together and say, we want to do this and we need to be able to access funding to be able to do that. So it's a more democratic process, but it just unlocks that ability to at least start those conversations about how they decarbonize their buildings. So, leaseholders are paying for the energy costs in their own flat, but they're also paying to a shared share towards the energy bill for the whole building as well through their service charges. So if we were able to unlock that, that would bring their costs down for them twice effectively.
It would definitely, and hopefully save money as well. As obviously,
Mm.
as we've been saying sort of throughout this, I mean, these EPC targets, I mean, upgrading these properties, it's going to be expensive. It's it's going to be really expensive to do.
I think I've seen figures that estimate to bring the average house at the moment up to EPCC would be about £7,000.
Wow.
So yeah, and that's a lot of money. If you think about a lot of buildings that are maybe share of freehold by the leaseholder, so these are residents that have clubbed together to buy a share of the freehold, so they're effectively the building owner. They have a dormant company, they don't have funds. You might have third-party landlords or developers with deep pockets that might want to do the right thing and try to save the planet and fund these types of things, but that's not really going to be an option for a lot of leaseholders. We've seen a lot in the news recently about soaring service charge costs for a number of reasons to do with insurance, the cost of labor, the cost of materials. So the appetite for people to fund energy efficiency improvements is really going to have to be backed by some kind of funding and incentive that it really will make a difference to their energy bills.
Exactly. And as you were talking there about service charges as well. Now, obviously, in 2025, there's going to be a lot of leasehold reform going on. So I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but just before the election, I believe there was the Leasehold Freehold Reform Act. Now, that was during the wash up period. So
Yeah.
there wasn't, so I believe some of those changes are only just coming through now, and then quite a lot of the stuff that was proposed didn't even make it through the bill because
No.
obviously it was just before the general election, so it was just
Yeah.
done really quickly.
Yeah, I think the previous government had made some promises to address leasehold, to reform it, maybe to get rid of it. Their attempt at reforming it was the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Bill. I think it was one of the last bills that was put before Parliament on Wash Up Day. There was a lot of amendments tabled. A lot of them were opposition amendments. So they kind of got swept up. And I think what Matthew Pennycook is now trying to do is to tidy that act up, but also supplement it. So we're now hearing about the draft Leasehold and Commonhold Bill. He's talked a lot about ending leasehold in this Parliament. I think that's fine. I think there are issues with leasehold. There is issues with any tenure. I think the reforms that they're talking about in terms of improving transparency, removing commissions, standardizing how service charge demands are laid out and offering more transparency over what service charges are paid for, making it easier for residents to take over the ownership of their buildings if they wish to do so. So we welcome all of those reforms. What the one thing that's missing from that, I think, is to regulate our sector. At the moment, you've got people who could potentially come from any walk of life, set up and be a property manager and take over the responsibility of the health, safety, well-being of residents in these buildings. You don't have to have any experience, you don't have to pass any exams, you don't have to have any entrance qualifications or anything to be a property manager. And that for us is concerning. You wouldn't go to a doctor who is unqualified. You probably wouldn't even book a holiday if it wasn't through a travel agent that was APTA bonded or ATOL. So I think we're all familiar with this. And as much as regulation can often be seen as a bad thing, I think proportionate regulation in this sector is something that's increasingly required. We've seen lots of new legislation coming. We're not finished yet, as you say. There's a lot of secondary legislation to come out of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act. You add on to that a leasehold and commonhold reform bill, then we're getting another tenure that we're going to need to look at. And I think it's important that the residents, whoever they may be, have confidence that the people that are responsible for managing, maintaining that building and collecting the service charges are competent and they're qualified to do that job. So we really want to see some form of regulation and some form of minimum sort of qualification standard, some kind of code of practice for anybody operating in our sector. They have a lot of responsibility, particularly with regards to health and safety, to making sure that the building is insured properly, to make sure that all of the service charge costs are done properly. So I think that is something that we really want Matthew Pennycook to really consider for this next piece of primary legislation.
Definitely, definitely. And I didn't actually realize how actually little regulation that there actually was. That's
Not
actually a
not
really good
many
surprise.
not many people do. As I say, to be a member of the Property Institute is completely voluntary. So our members recognise that they need to be properly qualified. We offer Ofqual accredited qualifications. We offer training. We offer guidance. We offer expert helpline. So they recognise the need to keep on top of all this legislation to make sure they're compliant. But actually, anybody that's outside of our membership is kind of almost free to operate however they want to with no oversight.
That's really interesting. And
Mm.
going on, because I wanted to talk about the Property Institute Manifesto. So you were just talking
Mm.
about there about the regulation that you want to see, and also we were just talking about the funding earlier on to do with EPCs. What are some of
Mm.
the key priorities in your Property Institute Manifesto that you'd like to see?
Regulation is definitely one of them. We need to, stamp out anybody that's in this market that is incompetent or behaving unethically. We definitely need some statutory input there, I think, to improve standards and almost to get this recognised as a profession. We definitely want to see more transparency. As I say, leasehold is not the perfect tenure. It does need reform, and I think some of these reforms that will be coming through the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act will definitely help that. Maybe that's a moot point if they're going to get rid of leasehold completely. Net zero, as I say, is a key priority. Whilst our members and property managers are not necessarily, they didn't own the building, they didn't design the building, they are responsible for it. So they're going to be a key player in terms of supporting and managing any energy efficiency projects or retrofitting projects. They're going to be at the key of that. So I think just that little implied term, that little bit of legislation that is needed to unlock that improvement and open up the dialogue, and also ensure that any funding pots are available to leaseholders and to building owners. I think that would help a lot. And then finally, our major ask is on building safety. Remediation of buildings is happening far too slowly. I think there's about 1,000 buildings that have works on site and completed, but there's another 3,000 buildings out there that have not had dangerous cladding removed. There are a lot of internal defects. A lot of the dialogue around building safety has been on cladding, quite rightly. There's been some very dangerous materials used to clad these buildings, and I think it's right that we get those off. But also, a lot of these buildings have a lot of concerning internal defects, like with compartmentation. There is no funding route for that at the moment, so we're very concerned about that. So we're still putting pressure on the government to say you need to get these buildings fixed. There is the remediation acceleration plan that the Building Safety Minister Alex Norris published, I think, in December last year. So we're just keen to see what that actually looks like, how they're going to make that happen. They have committed to make all buildings safe and be fully remediated by 2029. I can't see that happening personally unless they do something very, very drastic, because progress is very slow. And in the meantime, that leaves leaseholders unable to remortgage, unable to sell, paying high premium, and ultimately they don't feel safe in their homes.
Mm, exactly. And as you were saying that, it seems just to be going really, really slow. And the 2029 target, I mean, it feels like far away, but it will probably be here as soon as we know
It's
it. And I think as
absolutely.
well, I mean, you probably know more about this than me, but I don't think they've actually removed that many unsafe cladding yet.
They've done all the ACM cladding, which was the cladding that was identified at Grenfell. That first fund that they came out with was dedicated to that. They're making progress on the non-ACM cladding. I think any buildings that are going through the Building Safety Fund or the Cladding Safety Scheme are making a little bit more progress. I think those that are under the Pledge Developer Scheme, so where the developer has signed a remediation contract to say, yes, we will come back and fix it, I think that's where we're seeing the most delays, I would say. Some of that is to do with availability of contractors. Some of it is to do with negotiations as to what remediation and how much remediation is going to get done. But really, the government needs to use some levers to make that happen. It's very difficult because also we see the Labour government is going to be dependent on developers and house builders to reach their 1.5 million target. So it's going to be a tricky situation for them to incentivize those developers to do that, but at the same time fix the buildings that they've already built and that have problems. But it has been really disappointingly slow, and we're seeing the effects of that, as I say, across the lending industry, across the insurance industry, and just people's general feeling of well-being and safety.
Exactly. As you say, there's slow progress, but hopefully we will have to see what the government does do. And now I know it's a big question to ask, but what do you think of the future of leasehold reform?
I mean, I think, as I say, it's not a perfect tenure. We do need reform. I think one of our sort of strong messages is if you regulate the sector, if you regulate all the people that are managing these buildings, you will protect residents from a lot of the harms that are happening already. I think if you improve transparency, and I think if you improve the upfront information, I think a lot of the problems stem from people don't necessarily understand what they're buying when they buy a leasehold flat. And I think that has to start very early on in the sales process. It has to start at the sales office in the marketing materials so that buyers really do understand what their rights and responsibilities are as a leaseholder. I know it's very exciting when you find a flat, and particularly if it's your first home and you're very invested in that, but it is really important to read the lease. It's not the most exciting thing that you will ever read. It's a very long and boring document, but the lease really sets out what you can and can't do and what your obligations are. And I think people need to get curious about the service charges and what's going to happen to the service charges in the future. Sometimes when you buy a brand new flat off plan, the service charges will be really low because maybe only one phase of a development has been built. There's no garden on site, there's no cafe on site, there might not be any concierge. And as those bigger developments get built out and into third, fourth, fifth stages, and you might get a residence cafe, you might get parking, you might get a concierge, that's where the service charge costs are going to go up. And I think that's what people need to get curious about. And so the upfront information to help buyers understand what they're buying in the first place. Leasehold reform is definitely needed. As I say, if the government wants to move to a model of common hold, great. We've seen similar examples. The Scottish factoring system is very similar to a common hold model. It is not without its challenges. The strata model in Australia works very similarly to common hold. Again, not without its challenges there. So I think the white paper that comes out on common hold will tell us a little bit more about where the government is looking to go with that model. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter if you're a leasehold, if you're in retirement housing, if you're in student accommodation, if you're in a build to rent property or building, the people that are managing that building must be qualified and they must be regulated. And that will fundamentally change how people view living in tall buildings.
Exactly. I think that's what it comes down to, isn't it? That regulation. And as I was saying, I literally didn't even know like how little
You could
regulation.
be a property manager tomorrow, Gabriella. There's nothing to stop you knocking on a door and saying, "Give me all your money. I'll manage your building for you."
Yeah, it's just crazy that how little regulation there actually is and people don't know about it. So I hope that if any government ministers that are watching, please do listen to Jaclyn and everyone from the Property Institute, particularly with the transparency as well with leasehold. As you were saying, like particularly if you're a first time buyer, you might not necessarily read the lease because you're just excited that you
Yeah,
have like you have your new home and then you don't realize, oh wait a minute, it's actually leasehold and with the service charges and stuff like that.
yeah. Yeah, and I think there are, you've got the Leasehold Advisory Service out there, which is a government-funded organisation to support that. But I think it's important to make that decision and do your homework first before you make investment before you make that purchase. You know, there's a reason why you can't have pets, for example, you can't put in hardwood flooring because you're living communally in a building, and that's no matter what tenure it is, if it's a reformed leasehold or if it's common hold or any other new tenure, it doesn't matter. There have to be rules around people living together in one block. So yeah, and there will still be costs that come with that. If you want a concierge, you have to pay. If you have a lift, you have to pay for that lift to be insured, maintained, and run all the time. So I think it's important that people understand what their service charges are paying for and what the trend is and how that cost is projected to go up throughout their period of ownership.
Exactly, and that's some really good advice there as well, particularly for leaseholders. Well, thank you so much, Jaclyn, for joining me today. It's been really great to have you on and really interesting as well to talk about leasehold and the EPC changes and how that's going to affect leasehold properties. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.